Good morning. You know, when I came into church today, a number of people greeted me with a statement of, "You're wearing pants today." Now that's a statement that if you don't understand the context has a completely different meaning than you might expect. If you've been here the last 3 or 4 weeks, you understand that that means my knee is injured and because of that I've been wearing shorts while I've been preaching. If you didn't know that, that statement may mean that you might think we've gone far more liberal than we actually have in this church as far as what we do. Now, like that statement about my pants today, we're going to be looking at some verses where understanding the historical context actually makes a difference in how we interpret this passage. By the way, just to fill you in also for to get this out of the way, because a lot of people ask, on my knee, we're going to actually be waiting 2 more weeks. If the knee improves, which seems to be improving a little bit, we're going to let it go. If it doesn't improve, they did find some issues, and they'll go in with arthroscopic surgery, take care of it, and one way or another, in a couple of weeks, we'll find out what's going on for sure. Now, back to the passage today. In order to understand what's going on, we have to understand context, but in addition to that, we've got to ask one other question of ourselves. Why did Paul even bring this up here? I mean, Paul's going on about the church and about the gifts of the Holy Spirit and about a number of things like that, and all of a sudden he's talking about government. And it doesn't seem to be in place at first glance. It is in place, but at first glance it doesn't really seem to be in place. Let's look for a moment at the context of when this was written, okay? Critical to understand is that Romans was written in 58 AD. We can date this book fairly reliably compared to most books. We're pretty sure it was written in 58 AD. What's important to remember is Nero became emperor in 54 AD. We've talked about this before, but if you don't remember, most people when they think of Nero think of this horrible emperor who legitimately was an unbelievably atrocious emperor, okay? He was, for example, one of the things he used to do, he would take Christians, he would tie the Christians up, put them on posts in his garden, soak them in oil, and light them on fire to light his garden parties. And the people would all have to be at the party pretending like nothing was going on while these people were being burned alive to light up the party. That's the kind of emperor Nero was. So again, when you think Nero, you think not a good guy. What's not understood, though, is that from 54 AD to 60 AD, Nero was probably the best emperor that Rome had ever had up until that point in time. He was actually made an emperor when he was still a teenager. And he had 2 advisors, and the advisors seemed to keep him on track. And during that period of time, he set priorities. For example, like governors that were cheating people, get rid of them. They could face all kinds of penalties, even death sentences if they were mistreating the people. He was cleaning up all sorts of levels of government where the people were actually being put up front, and where he was actually making Rome, at that point in time, probably the best government that the world had seen yet to that point in time. It was actually, those 6 or 7 years were actually called the Golden Age of Rome. Now what people forget is, up until 60 AD this happened. In 60 AD something happened with Nero. His advisors went away, so we don't know if that was the cause, or we don't know if Nero went nuts or what it was. But Nero went from the best emperor up until that point in time to an emperor that rivaled Caligula as far as some of the worst emperors up until that time. So you had a complete turnabout as far as Nero goes and as far as the Roman government went as well. Now the reason that might be important is because Romans was written in 58 AD. When Paul wrote this, he was talking about a government which was, up until that point in time, certainly the best Roman government and one of the best governments and fairest governments that have been seen in the world. Now, that doesn't mean that we can ignore this, but it does mean that we have to look at it in context to understand what it actually means. The other thing I was going to say is, why did Paul bring up, I mentioned a minute ago, why did Paul even bother bringing up the government here? There was a misconception going on at that time, and frankly, we have it happen in our own time also. The idea sometimes is, look, we're new creations, we answer directly to God, we don't have to answer the government anymore. Not only that, in some cases today we hear people, we don't have to pay taxes because we're not subject to the government. And what Paul was trying to say is, wait a second, that's not the case, and you're going to see why here in a minute, because he's going to go into, in verse 5, he's going to tell us why he actually laid out these things. But the point being is, just because you're a new creation that's subject to God doesn't mean you're exempt from subjection to the government as well. Now, if we start in verse 1, we're going to see it says, "Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. One of the things I want to hit here real quick is when it talks about be subject or be in subjection. There is a minor distinction here, but I think we should understand this. It actually does not use the word obey, which in the Greek you'd expect to see. It actually uses the word which is be in subjection. Now, they're very close to each other, but here's the difference. For example, when he's talking in Ephesians 6 about slaves and about children, children and slaves, obey your parents, obey your masters. There's no leeway there. Not only that, there's no choice there. Frequently, the word for obey is used over and over and over again over slaves and of children. Subjection, on the other hand, is frequently used with government, is used with being in subjection to God for a believer. And while it's a very fine difference, I think one of the things we see is if you're not in subjection, you're still going to face consequences, okay? So you still have an obedience factor there. But I think in subjection, there's more of a choice to do it. Whereas in obedience, if a slave just simply said, I don't think I feel like doing that today, he would very quickly be beaten or killed or whatever. The discipline would be immediate. In the subjection, again, obedience is certainly part of this, but I think there's also more of a willful component here as well, where we willfully put ourselves under the authority of the government. Now, we also see in verse 1 that governments are established by God. This word established could also be translated as appointed or even ordained. But one of the questions you've got to ask yourself is, what do you mean governments are established by God? Have you seen North Korea? Have you seen Saudi Arabia? Have you seen China? I mean, just look around this world. And if you went back to ancient times, have you seen Babylon? Have you seen Assyria? Have you seen all these different cultures which had horrendous governments and treat people horrendously? Today, we look at a country like North Korea, which by most estimates during, I think it was the 1990s, if I remember correctly, starved to death a minimum of 10% of its population for political reasons. So, that's the kind of governments we're dealing with today. Something important to see here, it says God established or appointed these governments. It does not say he endorses them. So at no time is it saying God's thrilled that we have a dictator in North Korea who seems to be unhinged, okay? He's not saying he's thrilled that Saudi Arabia will do anything they can to stop Christianity and to carry out Islam. He's not saying that the Nazis were wonderful because we had Nazis, or the communists today are wonderful because we have communists. What he's saying is he is still behind controlling the earth. He's still in charge, and he has appointed these people. Now, one of the things we have to look back on from the historical examples is, as far as why God would allow this, at certain times God allows evil governments to take over because he has a use for the evil government. Not that he's blessing them, but think about it. Often, over and over with Israel had a covenant with God. Obey me, and I will bless you. Conditional covenant, okay? Well, Israel was not good at following the conditional covenant. And what happened over and over was he brought in Assyria, he brought in Babylon, he brought in the Persians, he brought in all these different countries to punish Israel, to bring them back to him. Once they were punished, then they're like, oh yeah, we need God. We forgot about that. Things get good. No, we don't need God anymore. And frequently, if you think about it, we have the same thing in our world today, although I'm not trying to equate Israel with something today, but the point being is God at times used evil governments. Another way he used them is that Babylon was ruling over Israel at a certain point in time and was an evil government. And what happened was he used Persia to kick out Babylon, put them in subjection, and the Persian kings actually said, hey, go back and build the walls of Jerusalem. Go back and build. So the point is that at times he used evil governments to bring about purposes which were good ends, but that never meant that God endorsed those governments. But what it does say is no matter who's in charge, God's still in charge. Something else to consider here is, let's say that Rome had not been in charge when Jesus Christ came to this earth. Do you know some of the differences? Number one, it would have been very difficult for the gospel to spread throughout the world. One of the things that Rome did is Rome built a road system through the entire world that allowed the spreading of the gospel. That really hadn't happened until Rome. Not only that, it was far safer to travel from country to country and city to city under the Roman government than it had been ever under other times. There was one central government in general that ruled over things. So even with Rome, we can look back and we can see you know, they weren't a good government, but God had a plan for it that allowed the gospel to spread. Now, today, I think I have to say this. Today, we look around our country, and I don't care whether you think Donald Trump is the next savior or whether he's the devil himself. That's not my point today, okay? But think about what we have. We have a country where people are screaming out, "Not my president." If we are a believer, I don't care if it's Barack Obama, Donald Trump, or whoever else, yes, he is our president. And factually, he is the president. But whether you like it or not, he is the president. Now, that doesn't mean we have to support everything he does, but it does mean it's disrespectful to go around and say, "No, he's not my president." That's not the thing a believer should be doing, and we shouldn't be supporting people who are doing that also. Again, you don't have to agree with them, but it does mean something where we shouldn't be going around and just disregarding who's been elected as president. That's what it's talking about here. In verse 2, it continues on. It says, "Therefore, he who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves." When you resist the authorities that are in charge, you are going against God. Now, let me say this. There are limits to this, and we're going to be discussing a number of these limits. But even though there are limits to it, in general, what God is saying is, be subject to the government. And one of the things we forget about also is the government is not just the presidency, the White House, the Congress, etc. The government are the representatives that filter down to us. Did you ever think about the fact, I was actually thinking as I was writing this, I was thinking about people in our congregation like Tarek, for example, who's a police officer. Did you ever think that when he actually goes out on a call, he is actually going out as a minister of God? And I don't mean just because he's a believer. What I'm saying is police officers on the street, as an example, are actually ministering on behalf of God. Now, does that mean that they're all doing right? Of course not. I've run into some bad police in PG County. It can happen. But despite the fact that I've run into bad police in PG County, I still have to look at it and say, as a whole, God has ordained the police forces to protect us, and it's part of God's plan. We may or may not like it, doesn't matter. It's right here in the Bible as far as what it is. Now, I mentioned before, there are limits to that, and we'll come across that as we go on. But when you see people rioting in the streets because they don't like who's been elected, that should not be the Christians. That should not be the church. It's that simple. When you see on the other side of the coin, I've actually met people who decide that they don't have to pay taxes because, for example, our government promotes abortion. And abortion is totally wrong, okay? But they decide that because of that, because there's too much influence from Planned Parenthood, therefore I don't have to pay taxes. No, you still have to pay your taxes. We still have to pay our taxes. We do not have the right to withhold the taxes because of that. In addition to that, I look around, I see people who call themselves anti-fascists who are rioting in the streets. And it's kind of ironic. I would guess personally, I bet that not 2% of our country knows what a fascist or fascism actually is. Most people can't define it and don't understand it. If you actually understand what fascism is, the anti-fascists are actually textbook example of what fascists are. And whether you like them or not, the people they're protesting don't fit the definition of fascists. Now, I'm not saying they're good or bad as far as the people they're protesting about. What I'm saying is they don't even understand the definition of what they're saying. My point is this: when we're protesting the government in violent ways like that, that's against what God wants us to do. Now, remember that 58 AD thing I said there beforehand about context? It does mean there are some limits because when Paul wrote this, it was a good government. And today, we could make arguments that we don't have good government in the world in a lot of places, okay? Although I do think we actually have, comparatively, one of the better governments still, despite its faults and flaws. But the point is, this isn't meant to be a patriotic message. This is a message meant to say, hey, this isn't what we as believers in the church should be doing. And we're going to see why in a minute, too. We haven't hit the why yet. It's important to understand the why before we go on from this. Now, if we look at verses 3 and 4, we see in verse 3, "For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good, but if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon the one who practices evil." You see that word minister several times in there. The government is acting on behalf of God. Now, two things. Number one, that's the way it should be. But number two, that's also the way God established things. Now again, in 58 AD, that's not only the way it should be, that's in general the way it was. Does that mean there were no corrupt officials in 58 AD? Certainly not. There were corrupt officials in 58 AD. But certainly less because Nero had been fixing that. And if we look in 1 Peter 2, 13 and 14, we see the purpose of government there. We talked about this last week. It says, submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as one in authority or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. That's what Paul's echoing here, the same thing. The point is, whether we like this or not, there are multiple places in the New Testament that talk about still giving honor and submitting to heathen governments. That may not be a popular thing to say, but that is still the truth. Now, when we look at this also, we see in verse 3, it says, if you are doing good, you have no need to fear. That's not always true today. Let's face it, we can find people who are being punished unfairly by our government. We could probably name a number of people like that. But it's still the ideal of how it should be, and it's still an ideal that says there has to be a clear, concise reason to act against the government, which we'll get to. But if you're good, I mean, it makes sense. Think about it. If you're good, you don't have to fear the government. They're not going to punish you. If we look in verse 4, it says again, government is a minister of God. Government is used to keep order. Now, one thing also here that we have to look at is, there's a lot of debate today over whether capital punishment is right or wrong. I'm not going to wade into that, but I will say this. These verses right here are specifically talking about the Roman government. The Roman government practiced capital punishment a lot more than we do. And they didn't have the trial court cases for it or anything else. In some cases, you're guilty, you're done, that's it, stab them, that's it. So it's not, if we start saying capital punishment is something which God could not approve of, well, wait a second. We've got an example here of God saying, obey this government, and this government is carrying out capital punishment. Now again, we can have debates on how it's carried out, methodologies of it, whether it's fair or not, but as far as is it intrinsically wrong, I don't think it could be because of what God's saying here. The other question we've got to ask ourselves is, why is government even needed? The answer to that is very simple. We have a sin nature. If we didn't have a sin nature, there would be no need for government. And think about it. We'd all be looking out for the other person. We wouldn't have to worry about it. It's the result of sin. But in an imperfect world, God has established governments in order to handle basically the disease of sin. Now, here's what we want to look at also. In verse 4, it says that if you do evil, be afraid. You should be afraid. I want you to think about something for a minute. This week had a horrifying story that I read. A story that was beyond anything I've read in quite a while, and that's saying something, okay? There was a woman in Atlanta who decided to take her 1-year-old infant and her 2-year-old infant and put them in the oven and bake them. And she baked them to death. And when she finished, she then phoned her estranged husband to tell him what she had done. Let me ask you a question. If there were no government to punish a person like that, and I use it because it's the most horrifying thing I could find this week. If there were no government to punish a person like that, would you feel there was justice in the world? Would you really be okay with, well, nobody can do anything, we don't have a government here? How about with people like ISIS that are going through the Middle East, slaughtering people, that are terror bombing throughout the world? Would you be okay if there was no government to step in for things like that? Now, I'm not saying the government is perfect in what it does, but there is a need for government, and there is a reason for evildoers to fear punishment. And the reason for this also is God is a just God. That's why God established government, because God's not happy when justice is not carried out. Does it always work? No. But it's still what God intends. Now, I want to look here after we've seen, okay, Paul has been saying, listen to the government, be in subjection to it. But I also want to look at, is it ever wrong to disobey the government? And the first thing we want to do to check that out is we want to look at some other passages in the Bible. You don't have to turn there, but if you want to, that's fine. We're going to look at Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. To give you the context here, the king has set up a 90-foot tall statue and said that everyone has to worship this statue and bow down to it. And there were three gentlemen, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it said here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar was the government. Nebuchadnezzar said, bow down to this 90-foot tall golden statue. These people said, no, we're not going to do it. That is resistance. Cut it any way you want to. That's people in the Bible God's praising and God's sparing who are saying, no, we're not going to do it. So there obviously is a time at some point in time to say no to the government as well. We also can see in Daniel 6, Daniel 6, 6 through 10, it says, Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. Now when Daniel knew the document was signed, so he knew it had been signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. We can see there that an unjust law regarding worship of God had been passed. We can see that Daniel knew the law had been passed. And we can see that Daniel said, I am going to deliberately disobey and break the law. So it's another case where a believer is saying, I'm not going to follow the government. I'm going to resist the government. In Acts chapter 4, verses 18 through 20, we have a situation where the apostles are told, you may not preach the gospel. It says, and when they had summoned them, they commanded them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge. For we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. Officials said, look, you can't speak about Jesus anymore. Disciples said, forget it. Not going to do it. We are going to speak about him. Clearly, again, going against what the authorities had said. They had to obey God, and there was a clear conflict here. One of the things we remember is people often want to quote, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's and render unto God what's God's. They forget that the second half of that is render unto God what is God's. Part of what is God's in this case is be telling people about Jesus Christ. They could not stop that. And I want you to think about something else that we do today. I wonder if you ever thought of. Do you realize that as churches, we often break the law of other countries? Hey, you might wonder, when do we do that? There are many countries where it is illegal to send a missionary into the country. And we will take a missionary and send him in as a consultant or anything else or whatever, and we'll sneak those missionaries into the country, and they'll bring the gospel and share the gospel. I'm glad we do it, and I think it's appropriate. But in many cases, that's breaking the laws of those foreign countries. But it's still appropriate to do it. I want to take a look at one other example here, which is Acts 16, and we're going to draw a conclusion from these examples in a minute. Acts 16, 35 through 40. Now when the day came, the chief magistrates sent their policemen, saying, release those men. By the way, to give you some context, this is the situation where Paul is thrown into the jail, and the Philippian jailer, where they have the earthquake, and the jailer is going to kill himself, and he's worried about that. This is the context here. So afterwards, the chief magistrates sent their policemen, saying, release those men. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, The chief magistrates have sent to release you. Therefore come out now and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They have beaten us in public without trial, men who are Romans, and have thrown us into prison. And now they are sending us away secretly? No, indeed. But let them come themselves and bring us out." The policemen reported these words to the chief magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans, and they came and appealed to them. And when they had brought them out, they kept begging them to leave the city. They went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia, and when they saw the brethren, they encouraged them and departed. Several things we can see here. Number one, Paul was saying, hey, I'm resisting because you said just leave. Wait, you beat me in public. I'm not leaving in private. You beat me in public, you're going to release me in public. Number two, Paul was saying, I'm a Roman. Ooh, that had to scare them, because Romans could not be beaten in public like that. It was a law where literally you could lose your life as a public official for doing that. That scared them. Paul was resisting and Paul was defying. There is a time to resist a corrupt government. That was a time. But let me point out something else here. Paul didn't go into the streets and start a riot. Paul had passive resistance, where he was showing, we're not going to allow this. We're not going to stand for this. We are going to resist you. But he didn't try to start a riot either. One of the things I wanted to say in all four of these examples I've given under obeying God is that all of them relate to witnessing for Christ or witnessing for God or the worship of false gods. When it comes to that, I do believe that a believer has no choice but to say to the government, I will not stop teaching about Jesus, and I will not worship a false god. That's one of those lines where we can see that's where it comes to obeying God rather than obeying man. However, that doesn't mean we should just ignore the government and disobey the government because we don't feel like it. It's a very clear reason here where this is happening. Now, there's other areas also where I think we have to look at obeying the government, and these are some moral issues. One question I have to say to you is I want you to think for a minute and pretend that you're in 1943 in Nazi Germany. And you're sitting in your house and you know that your next door neighbor is hiding a Jewish person in the basement. Do you go to the authorities and tell them or not? Because the law says you have to. And then they'll come and they'll take that person, send them to a concentration camp, and in all likelihood kill them. Do you follow the law or do you disobey the law as a believer? I think that's a case where it's very clear you disobey the law. I think one of the examples we can see is Rahab, even though she was not a believer at that point in time. She lied, and the Bible later praises her for lying because the people of Jericho were going to come and kill the Israelite spies. I think it is perfectly acceptable if the government is going to come and is going to kill someone for unjust reasons to lie about it and to hide those people. Not only that, we see that not only in the 1940s with the Nazis, you see it today with the communists. China has gone from extremely repressive to less repressive to getting a lot more repressive as time goes on. The last 2 or 3 years, it's been scary for Christians to look at what's happening in China. China is becoming more capitalistic, but it's also becoming scary as far as what's happening to believers, tearing down churches, tearing down crosses. And then if you think that's bad, try North Korea. And it's funny, when I was in Washington Bible College back in the early 1980s, I remember a professor there who had escaped from North Korea. Was it wrong? It was against the law for him to escape? No, it wasn't wrong. That was a perfectly legitimate reason for acting in the way they acted. Now let me ask you a question. We also have issues like abortion. I faced a very interesting situation many, many years ago, at least 30 years ago now, where someone wanted to come and speak to my father and I privately, and we met with him. And the person that we met with had previously bombed a number of abortion clinics, had been convicted, had then been released, and he wanted to sit down and talk with us. And our first thought was, whoa, wait a second. So we did sit down and talk to him, and the first thing we got out of the way is, are you still going to participate in bombing clinics? His answer was a strange one. I still remember it was, I'm no longer called to the ministry of bombing, which to me meant that he certainly felt that it was God's will that he bomb these clinics. By the same token, it also meant that he wasn't going to do it anymore. But one of the things I have to say here is, when it comes to abortion, Abortion is clearly morally wrong. But I don't think God gives us the authority to blow up abortion clinics. Even though no one was killed in what he did, something could have gone wrong, and it could have been. And not only that, it was still property damage. I don't believe God has given us the authority to blow up abortion clinics. Now, we also look at another, and we made that clear to him also. On the other end of the spectrum, years ago we had Operation Rescue. We had Operation Rescue that was doing passive resistance to abortions. I think that was completely appropriate. I think what the government did to Operation Rescue was absolutely wrong. And they did defy the government laws. In some cases, they passed laws which could only be applied to people who were protesting in front of abortion clinics that were absolutely unconstitutional, and they didn't care. By the same token, that sort of resistance is fine, because abortion is such a clear-cut moral issue. But it still doesn't give us the right to say, number one, we're going to withhold our taxes. It doesn't give us the right to start blowing things up. But we don't lose the right to speak out about what's right and wrong. So we have to be careful about this and see what Paul's actually talking about. It's certainly appropriate for believers in churches together to reach out and try to change the laws on abortion. It's not appropriate to blow up clinics. If we look at an issue like homosexuality, even though homosexuality is clearly wrong in the Bible, I have to say this, at least no one is dying from that in the way they are abortion. I think what we have to look at there is we should not participate in their sin. But we don't have a right to abuse them either. But we don't participate in their sin. Now, we look at something where with government interference, I'm going to give you my opinion on something. We have the issue with the cake bakeries or the bakeries. Baking a cake, I understand their position for a wedding, specifically a wedding cake, for a gay wedding, in my opinion, is participating in their sin. If you realize that, and I'm not saying you can't, but I'm saying, yeah, I can see their position on that. I think it's absolutely wrong for the government to stop that. We're not talking about normal commerce. We're not saying that homosexuals can't go into a Safeway or something like that. A wedding cake is a unique item that relates specifically to homosexual marriage. Because of that, I think they're right to stand up against it. And as a matter of fact, that even though they've lost many of the cases in the lower courts, is going to the Supreme Court this session, it looks like, and they'll decide there what they're going to do. In all likelihood, I won't say in all likelihood, if they lose it, it may still be worth it for them to stand up and say, I may lose everything I have, but I'm not going to change. One of the things we have to look at here also is abortion and homosexuality both. I had 2 fingers, not 3. Abortion and homosexuality. There's going to come a day, I can almost predict it, where in this country we're going to be told if we speak about it from the pulpit, we're going to be put out of business. We're going to be sued. We're going to be in jail. And if you think I'm kidding, it's already happened in Europe, and it's already happened to a large degree in Canada. People don't realize that in Canada today, you can already go to jail for using the wrong pronoun for a person who's transgender. That was just passed in this past month. They don't realize that pastors have been jailed for speaking out against homosexuality. And I don't mean in vicious ways either. I mean simply saying the Bible says homosexuality is wrong. I know that when I started my business, when I started Genesis Networking, the one thing I said was, the first thing I actually set up specifically, the purpose of Genesis Networking is not to make money as the primary purpose. That's the secondary purpose. The primary purpose is to obey God. And I can tell you this, there have been some contracts, one in particular, that was an unbelievably lucrative contract that would have given me anything I wanted, where I turned them down and said, I will not work for you. And the reason was because I believe they're hurting our country and they're against what God says. Not only that, I started out by saying, and I tell my employees this, we will not work for a pro-abortion group. We will not work for a pro-homosexual group. We will not do that. I don't care what networking services they need. We're not going to do it because we're not going to participate in their sin. Whether you think that's right or wrong, that's up to you. But I can't do that. Now, in addition to that, I have to say it's still wrong to use violence to try to change it. People forget this. They want to use violence sometimes. Not just the bombings, but honestly, it's wrong to use violence in any of these situations to try to change it. Now, if we look at verse 5 through 7 very quickly, we see, wherefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. So the first thing Paul's saying here is, because of our consciences, we need to do the right thing with the government so that God won't judge our conscience. But also because of the wrath. Remember I asked in the beginning, why do we obey the government? Why did Paul tell them to? Why did he bring this up right here? The reason's in verse 5. If you obey, and 5 through 7 actually, if you obey the government, and they're a good government, they're going to leave you alone. You obey the government so that instead of trying to find a, you don't want to be out trying to witness when the government's after you for taxes or for other things or for whatever. If we obey the government should leave us alone and give us the freedom to witness. That's why Paul was telling them that. Not only that, had these people had participated in some of the tax revolts that were going on at that point in time, the government would shut them down real quick in the Roman government. What he's saying is, don't do that. Don't do something stupid. The most important thing is witnessing for Jesus Christ. You're not going to be able to do that as effectively if you're in prison or killed. That is the why he was telling them this. Now, I will say this. That why, the reason I bring that up is that may no longer apply in some situations today. If you're in North Korea, for example, Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, obeying the government and doing what they say is not going to stop the government from coming after you if you're a Bible-believing Christian who's out there trying to witness. Therefore, different types of resistance may be necessary. But if possible, if the government is going to allow us to continue the freedom to worship and the freedom to teach about Christ, as much as possible, we should be saying, wait, we'll obey the government so that we don't make way. Basically, don't make an enemy if you don't need to make an enemy so that you can still share the gospel. If you look at verses 6 and 7, he specifically says, for because of this you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. Pay the taxes, follow the laws. That last phrase, though, I think is important to go over, honor to honor. I think that means respect the government. I think that means while we can speak out against it, while we have certain rights that have been given to us by the Constitution, it also means we got to watch what we say to some degree. It means disagreeing with the government, but being respectful in how we disagree with the government. I think that's actually what he's saying there. Now, let's look at some applications from this. Number one, we've talked about the Roman government, we talked about some examples. What about our government right here in the United States when the rubber hits the road? What do we do with our government specifically? Number one, we may have people that disagree with and I disagree with the government on a lot of things, okay? We have people that disagree with the government. But if you look at the historical context of our government, it's still a pretty good government compared to the rest of the world and compared to how it's been most places. And, compared to the Nazis, compared to the Soviets, compared to the Chinese today or North Koreans, our government is wonderful compared to them. Not only that, we are granted more freedoms than virtually anyone has been in history because of our government, and truly because of our Constitution is really where it comes from. Not only that, I would say that because the Constitution grants us freedoms, as citizens, we can disagree with the government publicly because the Constitution says that, and therefore we actually are honoring the government by disagreeing publicly, as long as we do it respectfully and nonviolent. Are there exceptions? Yeah, we should generally exist, but let me give you one right now. The Fellowship of Grace Brethren Churches has put out an alert. If you go to the Grace Brethren website, you'll find it. That is calling for churches to resist a law in California and any other law similar to it. It's California AB 569. Now, as a miracle of miracles, this law, I'll tell you what it is in a minute, believe it or not, this week, Jerry Brown, one of the most leftist governors in all of the United States, actually vetoed this law because even he saw you can't do this. He said it's a violation of freedom of speech. But what it would have said is that employers do not have the right, religious employers I should say specifically, do not have the right to make sure that their employees are following the same principles they are. For example, if we as a church if we were a church in California and this law had passed, we would be required to give homosexuals the same standing for employment as non-homosexuals. It goes against our doctrine. We can't do that. Doesn't matter. We would have no right to tell an abortion provider that he can't be a member of our congregation had this law gone through. This law was an absolute gutting of the religious rights of freedom of speech. Now, I think it's going to come back in California again. But that's why the entire fellowship is saying, wait, we need to resist this law. Not only that, what people don't realize, that's only one of a number of laws. There's another one coming through the pipeline right now in California, which specifically says that pro-life groups and churches cannot enforce hiring people with only pro-life views. So, for example, if you were a pro-life organization, you would have to hire people to represent you who were pro-abortion people. That doesn't even make sense. But that's the law they're trying to pass right now in California. Nobody knows what will happen if that one comes to the governor's desk. There are times to protest, and there are times to say, no, we're not going to do it. And it doesn't mean that we're being vindictive or disrespectful to people who have an abortion or who are homosexuals. It means we're certainly not going to hire them to represent us in church. We have a right to protest in those things, and we also have a right to be active in politics because our Constitution gives us that right, and therefore we're still within the framework of what's been set up. So I think that's still in compliance with what Paul said here. Now, when is resistance appropriate? Number one, when it violates the clear command of God. When it says you cannot witness, you cannot teach the Bible. When they say that you cannot stand up and say that certain sins are wrong or that Jesus is Lord, or for example, if the day comes when they tell churches, you can't say that Jesus is the only way to heaven because that's discriminatory. We're still going to say Jesus is the only way to heaven, and we will defy the laws if those laws are ever passed. I hope they're not, but if they are passed, we will defy them. That's not me trying to be a rabble-rouser or anything else. It's just trying to say there is a certain line of demarcation that does not get crossed by the church, period, if the church is doing what God wants. When there is a clear command that's being violated, we can't do it. We have to follow God. Also, I would say that there are certain cases for moral reasons. Life or death. I use Nazi Germany as an example. The churches as a whole in Nazi Germany were a failure. However, there were evangelical churches that held firm to the truth, and they were persecuted and largely put to death. But the mainline churches, believe it or not, I have seen, and I have it somewhere, a copy of Life magazine from the 40s, late 30s or 40s, that had the altar of the church with a copy instead of the Bible of Mein Kampf on the altar because it was required by the German government. The German churches should have resisted at that point in time. Fortunately, we're not there yet, but who knows where our country is going to end up. Then the next question is, what resistance is appropriate? For those of you who are old enough, we live in a very different society than we did back in the 1950s and 60s. I wasn't alive in the 50s, but I was alive throughout all of the 60s. Virtually all, except for a few months. One of the things I will never forget, and I never understood, was when I was in 5th grade at Glenmont Elementary School. And the principal came into our class, and the principal brought a young girl into the class and said that her and her younger brother were coming to our school. And the principal said that this is a young black girl and that we're not allowed to call her names. We have to treat her like other people. We can't mistreat her. We can't beat her up. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, has this guy lost his mind? Why would I mistreat somebody because of their color? Growing up in my house, the idea of mistreating someone because of the color of their skin was such a foreign idea that it wouldn't have even occurred to me. However, it turns out it would have occurred to a lot of the other people in that era. I didn't know that. I wasn't exposed to that. Again, the people I hung out with in churches and stuff, we never would have even thought of doing something like that. But I do remember him coming into that class and passing rules for how you couldn't mistreat the person because they were a different color. They've come a long ways in that respect as far as that goes because, again, you don't have that happening today, at least not in our area. What brings to mind, though, is going back to the 60s again and looking at the resistance that occurred in the 60s, okay? No matter what you think of him, my personal opinion is that what Martin Luther King Jr. did with the passive resistance was absolutely appropriate and exactly what should have been done at that point in time to try to fix things because our government, let's face it, in a lot of areas, I mean, I've heard stories back from the 50s and 40s and stuff about how people were mistreated and segregated. It's not right. So I got to say this, had we been a church back then, I think we should have been involved in that. I would have encouraged that. I would have said passive resistance is the way to go, and I think that is an example and a model for us today. I don't think we should be rioting in the streets, but I do think there are certain cases that are so extreme that we have no choice but to have passive resistance. Now, along with that, not that it's going to affect the government much, but you can put pressure on companies as well with boycotts. I'm not saying you should be loose with these, but I will say this. I haven't bought a box of Kellogg's cereal since probably a year. I haven't worn a pair of Levi's in 35 years. Yeah, I don't know if you check. These jeans here, they're LL Bean. The shorts I was wearing, the jean shorts, they're Wranglers. They weren't Levi's. I used to wear Levi's before that. There were reasons why I made specific choices not to buy their products, because when I found out how extreme those companies were and how they were pushing an agenda which was so anti-God that I said to myself, I can't buy their products anymore. That's acceptable. That's a decision we can make. I know this, it's funny, this week I went down and I got a haircut down at Seabrook Barbershop. And I'm sitting there and a guy walks in, he's sitting there and he said, I don't know who the guy was. Saying he was a season ticket holder for 40 years. And he watched the first game and hadn't watched any more NFL football this year. Frankly, I don't care what the protest was about. I turned off the NFL for the first time this year, period. I used to watch 3, 4, 5 games a week 5 years ago. Not anymore. I'm going to try to hit them in the pocketbook. You know, one of the things you got to ask yourself on these NFL protests is, if it had been a pro-lifer protesting on the field, how do you think the NFL would have reacted? I can tell you how they would have reacted. Years ago, some pro-lifers tried to do that. People tried to protest for other causes, not by kneeling during the anthem, but by wearing different clothing or things like that. They got heavy fines and they were suspended if they didn't stop. Personally, I don't care what the protest is. It's a football game. It's not a protest field. That's my personal opinion there, okay? That's personal. I'll give you that. But my point is, in general, boycotts, there's nothing wrong with a boycott. And frankly, that can even work in some cases with government. One of the ways people boycott with governments, look at California. Businesses are moving out of California almost as fast as they can run because of taxes. That's the business's way of essentially boycotting California. Millionaires are leaving Maryland, New York, and California. Well, Maryland stopped now, they changed their laws, but we're leaving Maryland, New York, and California, and Connecticut as fast as they could get out. The rich people could afford to move. We can't, but they could. Why? Taxes. Essentially, that was a government boycott. I also think it's appropriate to speak out against the government when you're uncovering corruption. My dad was a great example of that with the books that he did. He ended up on national TV many times and in the newspapers nationally many times, and it was because he took on the government when they were doing things that were corrupt. My point is, there are times to take on the government. There are times to uncover corruption. There are times when things are unjust. There are things when they're saying you cannot speak out about God. But what I am saying is, I believe the way to take on the government is passive resistance, not violence. And that's something that's often forgotten today. We are free to try to change the government. But if we really read Romans 13 without our presuppositions and without what we want, even though our government may be different than Rome was in those days, we still have to come away with the conclusion that we have to respect the government. We have a right to disagree, we have a right to certain protests, but we don't have the right to violence. And we don't have the right to dishonor the government as well. Now, I'm not sure how this message sits with everybody, because frankly, if you ask me what would I have liked to have preached as opposed to what's in the Bible, would have been a little different. Similar, but would have been a little different. What I'm trying to do is say, look, as a church, no matter what we think, we've got to go back to the Bible. We've got to look at the Bible in context. And that's how we need to make decisions about things that impact us today, whether it's government or whatever else we're facing today. Let's go ahead and pray.